When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube and welcome back to the Grease Comedy YouTube channel. Today's video, we're going to be continuing our Song of Ice and Fire reread. We're going to be doing Dany II today. So Dany II, just for a quick summary before we get into getting deeper into every single page, this is basically Dany's wedding to Drogo, as you guys can see on the screen. It more or less happens the same as it does in the show, outside of like the end part. The consummation is vastly different in the book. And I will say, I think the end of this chapter is probably the only thing that holds it down. I think this is a very strong chapter in general, as we see a lot of major things happen. I have it inside of my top 5 chapters so far that we've done in the reread. Both of Dany's starting chapters are very strong, which is something I knew I would expect, because she starts out very strong in my opinion. Like her first book, I really do like her character arc. But as someone who's not the biggest Dany fan, it is interesting that I have 2 of her starting chapters in my top 5 throughout the first 11 to 12 chapters. So let's get into it. We're going to start on page 99, and this chapter kind of has a weird format. So the beginning page is going to be kind of what's going on currently, and then we're going to have like a jump back into the past and then go back into the future. I don't know if it's supposed to be Dany recounting what happened in her mind while this is going on, or just to show us what happened, and then we can fast forward back into present. So let's get into page 99 and let's go. So page 99 starts with Dany and Drogo's wedding. We learn that everything is done under the open sky. That is very important to a man's life in the Khalasar. So it's very different than, say, Westerosi culture, where in Westerosi culture you would tend to get married in, say, a sept or something like that. Very different for the Khalasar. The Khalasar do everything under the sun, under the sky. And we also know that because of this wedding, because of Drogo's horde, Pentos is getting quite nervous. There again, it makes sense why they're nervous. There's 40,000 Dothraki warriors outside, with Khal Drogo, one of the mightiest Khals probably of all time. He's never lost a battle. He's this huge giant of a man. I would be a little nervous too if I was someone living in that city. And we know it's not just 40,000 as in the whole Khalasar. That's just the warriors. So there's also women, children, slaves. This is a massive amount of people, and this is all taking place right outside the walls of Pentos. And we learn that Illyrio has basically suggested that Pentos has doubled their city guard, which is to me kind of strange, because even if they did this, they would still probably lose in any type of battle against such a vast and intense and large force. They're gonna lose. So I don't know. To me, when I look at that situation, I think it's like, okay, this is just a fear move, because if the Dothraki were to attack, they would lose. And I do think, to a degree, actually doing more armament of your city actually poses maybe making you more of even a threat, because they're like, okay, well, they're building up all these men. What's stopping Drogo from seeing this as, you're trying to fight us, right? Especially when you look at like how the outside people view the Dothraki. It's a very like racist system towards them. On the Dothraki is this barbaric culture, that they aren't civilized and that they are beneath them, right? That is kind of how the Dothraki are viewed. Viserys' opinion here is not exactly like an uncommon opinion. What he is like saying like comes off very badly, but that's what a lot of people think in this world, and we know that just through the countless times we hear about the Dothraki from other people. We're gonna get a chapter next week, which is Ned 2, and him and Robert kind of talk about the Dothraki as kind of this barbaric people, but yes, they are very skilled at combat. That's kind of what everyone just sees the Dothraki as, these people that are good at fighting in the open like plain, and that's about it. So, to finish out page 99, we learn that Jorah Mormont has actually sworn his sword to Viserys. Now, I think this is really weird, especially when you like look at a reread and you think about this. It's like, why does Jorah do this instantly? Now, Viserys is thinking in his mind, okay, well, I'm the rightful king. This makes sense that he would want to pledge his sword to me. He's also an outcast of Westeros. It makes sense from that regard. But when you think about it from Jorah's point of view, and you think about it from maybe somebody like Dany, Jorah is offering his sword to someone who has no gold, no real power, and at this moment, no real hope of taking back Westeros. It should be a little bit of some warning signs that there's something else going on here that would lead someone to suspect, is he spying? And I think, to me, this really shows the opposites between someone like Viserys and someone like Tyrion. Tyrion would question people's motives. Like, why would you do that instantly? There has to be some reason. Like, when people start swearing themselves to Dany later on when she has power, that makes sense, because Dany is in a position where you could gain off of her, right? In this situation, neither Dany or Viserys really can give Jorah that. So that is something that we do need to remark. And also, while we're on page 100, and before we continue to get deeper into the book, I do want to say, I know page counts can vary on what kind of book you have, so I did want to point this out for anyone that's trying to follow along and maybe their page numbers are different. I am using like one of these smaller books. It's kind of like a pocket A Song of Ice and Fire book. So my page numbers are going to be probably bigger than if you're reading like the normal sized book. So I do want to point that out for anyone trying to follow along if they do get confused about that. I kind of just realized that as I was like looking up page counts for my video on George R.R. Martin writing Dream of Spring. But yeah, so let's get into page 100. We then turn to how quickly Drogo will give Viserys his crown. And there's an interesting idea here. It's like, Viserys thinks that this is just a trade, right? Dany, you know, he goes to Drogo, and then Viserys in return gets a crown. That's not really how things work. And we talked about this in Dany 1. It's not really how the Dothraki operates. And even Illyrio notes that Drogo will soon take Dany, and then they will have to present her to the Dosh Khaleen. If the omens favor war, they will have war. Again, so we see that this isn't this idea of, oh, okay, you married Dany, you consummated the marriage, it's time to go to Westeros and take my crown. That's not at all what's going on here. What's really going to happen is, because of the culture of the Dothraki, Drogo has to go back to Dosh Khaleen. And then also, not only that, we also have to see if, do the omens favor going to war, right? Because again, these are a religious people, and they look for signs like that. And Viserys, basically being the charmer, says, I piss on Dothraki omens, and asks, how long will I have to wait? Again, shows how impatient Viserys is. He is not someone that is able to do a long plot. Think about Viserys with like someone like Doran, and I think this is a big reason why Doran maybe doesn't stake his support for Viserys right away, because Viserys is quite the opposite of Doran. Doran is someone that can sit on his plans. He can be very patient, right? He's waited a very long time to get vengeance for House Martell. And Viserys is not that. And Illyrio even notes that. Illyrio responds with, a couple months or a couple years. What's the difference? You've already waited your entire lifetime for this. What's a couple extra months or years? And that's exactly right. I think Illyrio has a lot of wisdom in that, and Viserys really just doesn't listen to it. And Jorah also reinforces the idea of patience, and that the Dothraki do things on their own time. Viserys is not pleased by these answers. He wants it basically like you're going to the market. You know, he's like, okay, well, if I pay you, you give me good. You give me service. You give me whatever said good is. That's just not the way something like this works out. And Viserys just doesn't understand that, and he will never understand that as we move forward. And we get an interesting quote here where basically Jorah was talking about, you know, you can't beg a Dothraki, right? Or Drogo specifically. And Viserys says that the dragon does not beg. But Dany, in her own mind, of course she doesn't say this, she's not at that point yet. You know, she's at the very beginning of this, she's someone that is very afraid. She's someone that hasn't found her courage. She's someone that hasn't found herself as a person yet. And she thinks there are no dragons left, which is true in the regard that Viserys is really not like this person that would have been able to bring back the dragons or be this leader of the dragons like Rhaegar. You know, he was known as the dragon, right? It's not Viserys. But what Dany does not realize is that she herself is a dragon, and she will be the mother of dragons. Now, to finish out this page, we have Dany, again, because this is where we go back. So this conversation that's been going on here, and this is what I think is weird, right? Is that this whole time that we've been talking about this with Viserys, Illyrio, Jorah, it's like a flashback, right? Because when we have this, that Dany goes to sleep, like I guess the day before, and she has this dragon dream. So we know that this was all in the past, not at the actual wedding. Like this conversation wasn't happening at the wedding, which is different than the show. The show had all of this taking place at the wedding, which to me, I think makes sense. I don't think you needed to have that. I wish they would have done more of these dragon dreams. They didn't really adapt that at all for the show. And I think it's one of the things that makes Dany's plotline very interesting, especially early on. So I think they missed on this. But we have Dany having this dream where she sees that Viserys is physically abusing her, repeating over and over again, "You woke the dragon," or "Don't wake the dragon," until she hears fire crackling, and she sees a great column of flame and a dragon amongst the fire. When their eyes meet, she wakes up. And this foreshadows the end of the book, obviously, and it's this great moment where George does so well with foreshadowing events here and there, and it kind of builds up to this idea of why Dany feels like she can go into the pyre at the end of the book. In the show, and this is one of my major complaints with Dany, is season 1, right? They did her story pretty well, but they didn't really feel like there was as much foreshadowing for the dragons hatching and why Dany does step into our funeral pyre the way she does. And this is one of those scenes that helps build that. And another thing that I think is interesting is that these dreams usually occur when she's very afraid or she's going through some sort of struggle and needs help. And this helps her because when we see the actual wedding happen, all throughout this wedding, she's going to be reminding herself that she is a descendant of Aegon the Conqueror, or that she has the blood of the dragon, or she's a Targaryen. This is one of those big moments where this helps her get through this very rough situation, especially for a young girl who's only 13 years old. I can't imagine any 13-year-old girl being like super confident at this moment, being super, like, not being afraid at all. I know it's probably possible. There are some, women that are just amazing out there, but this is a really hard event. Like, you're getting married off to this very scary looking dude who you can't even speak the same language of. You're supposed to have sex with him at the end of the night. For a 13-year-old girl, very, scary. Again, it takes a lot of Dany's courage to get through this wedding. And that will lead us into page 101. So page 101 sees us back to the beginning of the chapter at the wedding. And as the wedding goes, all day there was a ton of food and drink for everyone. Dany notes that she had never seen so many people because, again, 40,000 Dothraki warriors, plus you would have all of the people with them, women, children, older people. You would have slaves there. You would have any Pentoshi that possibly could have gone to this wedding. Illyrio, Viserys, Jorah, they're all there. So there is a lot of people here, and Dany notes that. And what's interesting is that Dany notes that there's a ton of people, but later on in this chapter, later on in this page, she's going to note how she feels so lonely. So she's in a crowd of people, but she feels alone. And that's something that is very interesting to note. We see that with Arya in her first chapter, where she feels very lonely. She feels unloved, even though she has a bunch of people around her. And we also note how much Viserys is hating this event. He is being sat below Dany. Every food dish is coming to Drogo, and then Dany before Viserys. So we look at this event, and it's kind of foreshadowing to Viserys' character arc as a whole in this book, where Viserys constantly, his whole life, has been looking for what Daenerys has gotten. Power. Being able to be important. Viserys has never had that. And if he has had that, it's really been just people playing with him, using him for their own gains. And as we see this go even further, where people start to love Dany and people start to actually care about Dany and really put her in a very powerful position, Viserys just breaks. He's a very tragic character that was never given any of this attention or love that he felt he deserved. And like I said, Dany, while this is going on, she just feels alone. Like, not only is she not even like and they did a different thing in the show where they had Dany actually sitting next to Drogo, but in reality, it's Drogo is kind of sitting at like the top, and then Dany is like a little lower than he is. Like, they're not like on the same bench like this. So I do think that's interesting to note that even in the book, there is this hierarchy that yes, the male is still more important than the female, and how the Dothraki kind of view the woman, right? Where it's the Khaleesi, where yeah, she's still very important. She's still sitting above everyone, but she's not on the same level as the Khal. And, you know, for a while, Dany's able to keep up this facade of being happy and smiling like she's told to do by Viserys, but every once in a while, she just can't hide it. You know, she cries for a little while, or she'll cry for a little bit and try to wipe it away so Viserys can't see. And this is a rough point. And that will kind of get us into 102. And like I said, Daenerys kind of continues to tell herself who she is, and she is the blood of the dragon, and she is the seed of Aegon the Conqueror. And then we also see this idea of violence. Now, what's interesting, and I noted here, is that there's less violence, or probably death, in this wedding than probably like any wedding in the rest of the story. Which is interesting, but also it introduces the idea that weddings are dangerous. I mean, think about it. Every wedding after this one doesn't go well to a degree, right? Like, something goes wrong. But yeah, we see that there's this custom of violence in the Khalasar. Dany notes a dozen men die during her wedding day. Whether that is fighting for women or not, the scene that we see like in the show, where they're kind of fighting over this woman, trying to basically take her, does happen in the book, and we see that. But there also are other deaths that we're told do happen during this wedding. Also, we learned from Illyrio that a wedding without at least 3 deaths is a dull affair. And also, I wanted to note, some of this is from 103. I kind of mixed the two together because it kind of made sense. But that will kind of get us into page 103. As time is passing, Dany is growing more afraid because of the Dothraki, and 2, because of failing Viserys. So, Dany knows, like in the back of her mind, that regardless how quickly this day goes, at the end of this is going to be the consummation, and that's what she's most scared about. And as the day goes on, her kind of fear grows. And we get to this part of 103 that I think is probably the most interesting, is the bride's gifts. So this is something that's interesting that we don't really see in Westeros, is this idea that not only do, like, the couple themselves get gifts, right? So the male doesn't always get the gifts and everything goes into that. Dany herself is given things, right? Whether that's from Drogo, whether that's from other people giving her gems and all these things. Like, she gets a lot, right? So there's this idea, like, back in, say, the Renaissance or medieval times, where you would pay a dowry, with a woman getting married. So there was that idea here, but it was more like it was people just giving gifts to Dany. And there's an interesting idea where there's a bit more, like, I guess, importance placed on the women in this, like, Dothraki type wedding than I would say other types of weddings, whether that be in Westeros or Essos. Always thought that was an interesting concept, and I thought it was a really cool idea. Now, there is some interesting ideas here that don't make a lot of sense. Like, when we get to the Blood Riders and giving Dany the 3 weapons, it's a weird idea. It's like, why don't we just give that to Drogo? Like, why is that given to Dany to then Dany give that to Drogo? It's a weird idea. But as we start with the bride's gifts, Viserys, who, again, all of these are probably paid for or supplied by Illyrio, gives Dany 3 handmaids, 1 to help her with writing, 1 for helping her to learn Dothraki, and a 3rd for the art of lovemaking. So these are basically just supposed to help Dany kind of get into the Dothraki culture and to help that process along. Because, again, being a Khaleesi is not an easy thing. Like, especially for a woman, you need to be able to ride a horse for long hours. You need to, again, especially for Dany, who is someone that has really no idea about Dothraki culture. She doesn't speak any of the Dothraki language. She's going to need help in that. Like, you know, she's going to have to learn pretty much an entirely new language. And then the third is just for the art of lovemaking, so pleasing Cal. That's what Viserys wants there. And that's going to get us into page 104 with more of her gifts, and more importantly, probably the biggest moment of Dany's storyline so far. So getting into page 104, Jorah also gives her the books and of the histories of the Seven Kingdoms, which Jorah kind of notes, you know, it's a poor gift or whatever. But I do think, like, this is actually a genuinely good gift. Like, could you imagine someone from Westeros that, like, they haven't really lived there at all? Right? Like, Dany is someone that, you know, she was born there, but she never lived there. She doesn't know a ton of the histories. A lot of the histories she knows about Westeros come from her brother. So getting a book on the actual histories of her homeland, a really nice gift. A very sentimental gift for Dany. And I think she actually genuinely did like those books, because those would have been a really interesting read for her. Now, lastly, we see Illyrio give her 3 dragon eggs, to which Illyrio says they are from a shy and have turned to stone. Now, likely these are the same 3 eggs Alyssa Farman stole during Jaehaerys' reign that she sold to the Sea Lord of Braavos. Because again, there's not really any circumstances where like Braavos or Pentos or any of these like cities would have had access to dragon eggs, even if they have turned to stone. So we look at that point, and Dany's eggs are more than likely the ones stolen by Alyssa Farman, and that kind of sparks a lot of theories. Why are Dany's the 3 eggs to hatch, while none of the other eggs, after a certain point, hatch? Interesting idea, and you especially look at when these eggs have been in possession of, presumably, the Sea Lord of Braavos, compared to being in the care of Westeros, where you have maesters who look like they don't like dragons being around. Interesting idea that those are the 3 eggs that do end up hatching later on. And Dany, again, like I talked about in the last page, received her other 3 gifts. Or Dany also received other gifts, like the 3 weapons that all went to Drogo, and other gifts she received, like clothing and jewels. So another thing, again, she basically gets decked out here. Like, people are giving her really nice clothing, fancy clothing. She's getting jewels. She's getting all these things that, like, Dany as a woman is growing in wealth very quickly because of this wedding. And we see how important it is for Dany to be marrying someone like Drogo. It gives her a ton of power. She just doesn't really realize that as of now. And then I'll get into 105 when we see her, probably her, I would say at this moment, her favorite present, but getting her horse Silver. So getting into page 105, pretty much this page is about Dany. She gets this horse, and it's the horse that we see in the background, and the name is Silver. Now, what I think is very interesting is George kind of parallels the horse to Dany a lot. So there's this idea that this horse is very young, it's silver, which is all things that, like, Dany right now, she's very young. Her silver hair makes her stand out. Like, if you look at the people in the background, like Drogo himself, Dany sticks out like a thorn. And I think it's one of the reasons Drogo marries or even goes after Dany, is because of how unique she is in this world. So, yeah, I wanted to point that out because it is a big similarity for the two. Now, what I think is also interesting here is that we learn that the Khaleesi needs a horse to match her station. So just like how Drogo usually gets the best, or a Cal, I should say, gets like the best, the war horse, the biggest, the best one that they can provide, Dany as well gets a very good horse. And Dany even notes like that Drogo gives her the wind. That's something when Dany starts riding Silver, when she gets done, she has like Illyrio translate that to Drogo. So we understand that this is a very high quality horse. So again, there's a lot of perks of being a Khaleesi. Like, you get a lot of things that in maybe Westeros culture aren't the same. Like, you're not given the same amount of like respect as I feel a Khaleesi is given, even though you're still not given like the most amount of respect as say a man would in this world. So then Drogo picks her up, puts her on the saddle. And she's kind of like sitting here like, what am I supposed to do? And Jorah basically tells her to ride. She doesn't need to go far, but just ride the horse. So that'll get us into page 106, and we'll kind of see her do a little ride around, and we'll get to kind of the end part of the chapter, which is, in my opinion, my least favorite part of this chapter. Probably my least, I don't know if I'd say it's my least favorite page, but it's one of my least favorite pages in all of the early part of the book. All right, so into page 106. We see Dany for the first time of this entire wedding. She's not afraid, right? Like, she's riding around. She even gets the courage to have Silver jump over a fire pit. And it feels like she has wings. Again, more foreshadowing to Dany being the real dragon, not Viserys, and also her one day being able to ride a dragon. When she comes back, again, like I said in the last page, she tells Illyrio to tell Drogo that he has given her the wind, to which he smiles. Now, this is a huge compliment. I feel like, especially for a Dothraki, when you give someone a horse and they are basically like, yeah, that was awesome. This horse is amazing. That is going to be like, that's a really big thing when you look at Dothraki culture. The horse is a very important symbol to them that you can understand why in the book, it's more of like a mutual like respect type thing with Drogo and Dany. Like when we get into their like little sex scene, it's not really rape. It's actually consented between the two. And maybe it's like Dany in the moment realizes she's going to have to do it at some point. But again, it's not like this thing in the show where it's just like Drogo gets her alone and then just pretty much rapes her. Like, that's not really how it happens in the book at all. And this is kind of one of those things that I think makes Drogo respect Dany a little bit more. And at this point, it's time for the consummation. So she gets back and, you know, Drogo is basically saddling up and they're going to go on this little ride until they find a place, and again, in the open stars, and they're going to consummate the marriage. Now, Viserys has to interrupt all of this because he's just that guy. Like, he you know, like, things are going well for Dany. Dany is pretty much almost forgotten about the consummation at this point. She's feeling good. And then Viserys is basically like, you better please him or you will wake the dragon. And that's kind of how 106 concludes. And we're going to get into 107 and 108 where she's basically being let off and the consummation happens. My least favorite part of this chapter. This is probably the part of the chapter that keeps this chapter from being like one of my favorites early on, even though it is still in my top 5 so far, the ones we've done so far. But that will get us into page 107. Into 107, she is following Drogo this entire time on horseback with Silver, and she's constantly having to remind herself that she is the blood of the dragon. And they eventually stop, and Drogo lifts her off Silver. Now, Dany, very similar to where we see in the show, starts to cry. And Drogo looks at her and says no. And we get this understanding that Drogo probably only knows the word no at this point. But I think Drogo, just going off of body language and understanding probably what the word no means, doesn't want her to be like uncomfortable and all enforced it and stuff like that. He wants it to be kind of more consensual, is what we get from Drogo in the book, it would appear. And this does give her like a tiny bit of comfort, right? Like, yes, it is a small thing where he's only saying the word no, but this is part of the common language. And Dany finds some comfort in that. And it also kind of puts about this idea that Drogo maybe is trying to learn some of the common language, which is a comfort, I think, for Dany in this moment. Now, again, I note in my notes that this is significantly different than the TV show. Drogo basically sets her on a rock, and he does this for 2 reasons. One, it's kind of a respect thing, because again, Drogo is this huge, massive dude. Like, it's like kind of the mountain put next to like Sansa or Arya, right? So he puts her on a rock. So she's sitting on a rock, and this now allows them to be able to like sit face to face at about the same height. So Drogo's doing this thing where he doesn't want to put her in a situation where he's looking down over her, making her more uncomfortable and scared. And something that's interesting in this moment as well is that Dany in her own mind thinks that there is a certain warmth to Drogo that she hadn't really expected. Like, she kind of viewed this man as a big warlord, a barbarian, someone with no comfort, no warmth within him. And we see as she gets to know him, she sees that side of him that a lot of other people do not. And what we see is kind of Drogo kind of starts fiddling with his bells and taking all that out. And Dany just starts to help him undress and kind of, not undress, well, taking his bells out first and then kind of helping him settle down. And that's going to get into like 108, where the flip side of this is going to happen. So it's a weird like situation where, in a way, both of them are kind of helping each other. They're respecting each other, which is a very different take that the book, or I guess it's not a different take, it's the original take. It was a very different take where the show went with that. And I'm not sure why the show went that route. It does seem very weird to me that they chose to make that decision. I still don't know why they did that. If you guys want to know, let me know down in the comments. Why do you guys think the show went the way it did with Dany and Drogo's relationship? Was it maybe to simplify it? Because I do think it kind of takes away a bit of Drogo's character and does really make him more of just a brute. In the show, in the book, I think there's a little bit more complexities to Drogo and more warmth to him, like Dany suggests. So in 108, Drogo then like kind of switches it. He helps her to undress slowly, which is, again, another thing that's very interesting is that Dany does not expect Drogo to be very gentle with her. Like, he is gently helping her take off her clothes, like not, ripping any of her clothing or anything, which is an interesting idea. And he then begins to like kind of grope at her breast a little bit, and Dany puts her hands over them, to which Drogo says no and removes them, to which Dany then also responds no, and he basically stops. So it's an interesting idea that they took this part of it from in the show, but they removed like the maybe not the context, but like Drogo respecting Dany saying basically no, which is interesting. And then we have this like period. It's a really odd like final part of this chapter where they're both basically fully undressed and nothing's happening. They're basically just sitting next to they're basically sitting on said rock and him on the ground, and they just sit for a while. Drogo just watches her. And then what we see is Drogo begins to lightly touch her, holding her hand, massaging her, trying to make her feel comfortable. And eventually he moves to her breasts and then pulls her into his lap and asks once more, no. Or he kind of does it in like a no, like questioning no, to which she responds yes, and they begin to consummate their marriage. So it's a very interesting take on how this relationship starts, book to show. But let me know what you guys think about this chapter. I think this is a very good chapter. I'm just not a big fan of the ending of the chapter. I like it more than I like the show's take, but just not a huge fan of what happens at the end of the chapter for me. But let me know what you guys think. I'd probably give this chapter like a 9 out of 10. I thought it was actually pretty good. I mean, a lot of building on Dany's character, relationship with Viserys, a lot about Dothraki culture, a lot of foreshadowing to Dany as she goes forward and her connection with the dragons, a ton of foreshadowing to her being the one to bring back dragons, her eventually riding a dragon. So a lot here for Dany. It's a very pivotal chapter for Dany, and I like a lot of these chapters usually are early on. And I like the way that this chapter is going to feel very connected to the next chapter. So when we go into Ned 2 in next chapter, they're going to be discussing this exact event that happened. So I love that in a way, like Dany is very connected to our main story in this book. It's the reason that I think Dany, to me, I like her a lot more in this book than others, because in the other books, she does feel like she's disconnected from the main story, especially in the second book. In the second book, she really has nothing to do with the main story, like Westeros stuff, outside of like the House of the Undying. So I really love that this chapter directly correlates to our next chapter with Ned 2. But thank you guys all for watching. I hope you can see you guys in our next chapter with Ned 2. That one's just going to be it's mainly just a discussion with Robert Baratheon. And I will see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.